This build is so good that if you don't use it, I will fight you. Don't make me do this. Initially, I tried using well-lock builds for the corrupted GM, and while they are really good, you definitely don't need 3 well-locks on your team, which is why I highly recommend that you use this build if you're doing corrupted or any activity, but especially the ones that have overloads and unstoppables, and you'll see exactly why in just a moment. I'm gonna break down all the weapons, the armor, the stats, the mods, everything that I use. Let's start with first the subclass. We're of course using Warlock Shadebinder. Definitely choose Healing Rift. This is gonna be one of our best options for healing, and we're gonna be able to get these back extremely fast due to the mods and fragments that we're going to choose, which is basically going to give us infinite heals for yourself and for your teammates if you're doing the GM corrupted like I mentioned, or if you're just doing a raid or any activity. This is always a good option. Burst Glide, best jump. You don't get to change your melee, so Penumbral Blast. And then for the grenade, we'll definitely need to use Cold Snap, and the reason why is because Osmiomancy gloves allow you to get 2 Cold Snap grenade charges, so you'll definitely want to choose this one. Trust me, I tried using Duskfield because it had a lower cooldown. It doesn't matter. You want to use Cold Snap. Now we'll go to the aspects. We're going to be using Glacial Harvest, which is that freezing targets is going to create those shards, and those shards are going to be very, very helpful because they're going to give us an overshield. We'll get to that in just a moment. The next fragment will be Bleak Watcher. This is what allows you to turn them into those little mini turrets. I'm sure most of you have seen these around before. They've obviously been very powerful for a long period of time, but for the corrupted GM specifically, this week it has Stasis Surge, which is 25% bonus to outgoing stasis damage, which makes these even more powerful. Stasis builds and stasis weapons are just that much stronger, which is why you especially want to use this for the corrupted GM this week. All you have to do is hold your grenade down and this will charge it up. You'll throw it and then it will start doing all the work for you, just shooting every target nearby, slowing, and then eventually freezing those targets. And we're going to spec into that even a little deeper going into our fragments here. The first one is going to be Whisper of Torment, which is you gain grenade energy each time you take damage from targets. What I've found is that constantly when I'm in GMs, everything is shooting me. I'm usually chilling in a healing rift, and so I find that I'll be able to get my grenades back a little bit faster using Whisper of Torment. However, it's not entirely necessary for this build. It just makes it a little bit stronger for regenerating your grenades back as fast as possible, because you're going to always want one of those turrets lurking around, shooting targets for you. And keep in mind that shooting one blast from this turret actually stuns overloads, and shooting multiple blasts will eventually freeze a target, which actually stuns unstoppables. This week's champions feature Overload and Unstoppables in the corrupted. This build stuns both champion types without even having to shoot a weapon, which allows us to spec into much more powerful weapons so that we're not limited to the anti-champion weapons, which makes this build so unbelievably strong. And we'll get into exactly what weapons to use in just a moment. So first up, Whisper of Torment is the one I went with. The next one was Whisper of Durance, which made it so that each time that turret shoots a target, it's going to be slowed for a little bit longer than usual. So this is going to enhance our Bleak Watcher turret. The next fragment will be Whisper of Refraction, which is defeating those slowed targets or frozen targets grants you class ability energy, which is the reason why we're able to get basically infinite rifts. We can constantly place healing rifts down because we're throwing turrets that are slowing targets, freezing targets, and feeding us more rift energy. So basically infinite heals, infinite slowing targets, infinite freezing of targets, and infinite champion stuns of both champion types in the corrupted GM, which is why this build is really powerful. The next fragment we'll talk about is Whisper of Rhyme, which is that collecting those stasis shards is going to give us an overshield. That overshield is basically like your woven mail if you're used to using any sort of strand builds. For most Grandmaster builds, you're going to want healing and some form of damage resistance, so that way you can tank all of the things that are shooting you. Whether it's woven mail, an overshield, doesn't necessarily matter. And I found that due to the amount of crystals I can create, I basically always have an overshield when I need it, and this made this build super powerful. But there is one variation fragment that you can use that makes Whisper of Rhyme even better, and that is Whisper of Conduction. This is going to make those stasis shards track to you. I did slot this into the build and completed the GM several times and felt like it was actually really worth it. So it's kind of a trade-off. Do you want the build to be a little more powerful, or do you want the ease of use there where the shards track to you, constantly giving you that overshield? You can make that decision for yourself. If you are going to put on Whisper of Conduction, I would best recommend using it over Whisper of Durance in this build. Let me know which one you end up going with down in the comments. Now let's break down the exact weapons that we're using for this. This week, the corrupted GM has Solar Surge and Stasis Surge, so obviously you're going to want to use those two different weapon types. But even if those surges aren't on, these weapons are very powerful for Grandmasters. The first exotic we're talking about is Wicked Implement that I'm using in the kinetic slot. Now I know a lot of you will be saying out there, why are you using this when Polaris Lance is so unbelievably potent right now? And while that is true, and I definitely recommend to prioritize using Polaris Lance, in fact I used Polaris Lance with this build and it was still really strong, I purposely chose to use Wicked Implement because I wanted to lean into the Stasis fantasy a little more. Stasis builds have not gotten much love in a long time now, so I wanted to really lean into it as much as possible, making as much Stasis stasis shards, slowing and freezing as many targets as possible, and Wicked Implement just complements this build so well, so that's why I chose to use it. And on top of that, it is an exotic scout rifle that does 40% more damage to red bars, and the benefits for using this with the stasis build are extremely nice. Rapidly landing precision hits cause targets to become slowed, and keep in mind that when we defeat slowed or frozen targets, it grants you class ability energy, so the exotic ties nicely into this build here. On top of that, it obviously has headstone, so precision final blows with this will create a stasis crystal at the victim's location, which is excellent for ad clear. You can shoot the crystal, blow it up, it kills nearby ads, and those shards that you create a ton overflow the magazine, giving you a massive magazine so you don't have to reload as often. And keep in mind that those headstone crystals that you create get destroyed by Wicked Implement, and due to its trait right here, while creeping attrition is active, destroying stasis crystals or landing precision final blows creates a stasis shard, and those shards obviously give us Whisper of Rhyme, giving us that overshield, which is why you can see in the gameplay behind me here, I just have crystals everywhere, overshields like crazy. I cannot be killed with this build. These stasis shards specifically will track and return to you and overflow the magazine, which creates some beautiful synergy with this weapon paired with stasis builds. But alternatively, if you want to, you can definitely just rock Polaris Lance. You'll still benefit from all the ignitions and explosions that this has. Don't feel like you have to use Wicked Implement. I just found it to be a lot more fun to fulfill the stasis fantasy that I've been wanting for so very long, which is stasis builds to be the meta, because I feel like they've been neglected for far too long now. And there are some artifact perks that we'll get to in just a moment. But with this build, if you're using Wicked Implement, then of course we're going to want to use Cartesian Coordinate, just because this is really good damage output to champions or to the boss. And then lastly, I went with Briar's Contempt. Again, more damage to the boss. We had one person on our team using Cenotaph Mask and using a Divinity. So those are the two weapons I went in the energy slot. It really doesn't matter too much though. Those don't tie into the stasis build. Now let's go through the armor mods that I have on my helmet, gauntlets, chest, boots, and class items. Starting first with the helmet, this is again a build specifically for GMs. I recommend that everyone, when they're doing Grandmasters, to have these two mods on. No matter what your build is, have on Heavy Ammo Finder and Heavy Ammo Scout. This adds a really good dynamic between you and your teammates, so that way you create power ammo for yourself and you also give some to your teammates. This makes it so there's just power breaks everywhere. This tied in with one person having either Cenotaph Mask or maybe an Aeons basically makes it so you don't run out of power ammo. So when it matters most and you need to melt champions or melt the boss, you have that power ammo there for you. So I always recommend those two for GM builds specifically. And then the last mod on the helmet that we go with is a Stasis Siphon, so that way we create orbs when we get multiple final blows with our Wicked Implement exotic scout rifle. Next up, we're moving down to the gauntlets. Of course, we're using the exotic Osmiomancy gloves. These are kind of a standard if you're using Stasis Warlock in challenging endgame PvE. If you haven't unlocked these yet, make sure to do so because they are so powerful, so fun. What they do for you is your cold snap grenades have an additional charge that recharges quicker on direct impact. The seekers spawn from the cold snap grenades travel further, so that's why you have to use cold snap if you're going to rock these. You get the double charge. The seekers travel further, which just makes them so powerful. To pair with this, I had a stasis loader mod on, so that way my Wicked Implement reloaded a little faster. And then for the mods, we had on momentum transfer, which is causing damage with your grenade, improves your melee cooldown, and obviously those turrets are causing a lot of damage. They're categorized as a grenade. Along with that, we had bolstering detonation, which would also give me class ability energy for causing damage with my grenade. Again, the turret causing damage, so you get more class ability and melee energy back really fast. And you could alternatively, if you want to, just use 2 bolstering detonations. This would be a little more advantageous. I just like to get my melee back a little more because every now and again it's nice to have a panic button and freeze the unstoppable champion that's 2 feet in front of you. But technically speaking, if you're trying to create that gameplay loop with infinite rifts, this would be a better combination, so you can make that decision for yourself. Moving on down to the chest piece now. For corrupted and for most activities, rainbow resist is really good. Void, solar, and arc resistance is what rainbow is. For a lot of dungeon builds, I mentioned using melee damage resistance, but in GMs, ads are just too powerful. You're too under leveled by design, so basically you're not going to want to let the enemies get that close to you. So keep your distance with an exotic scout rifle or a more ranged weapon like a bow, for example, and use rainbow resist. You'll survive a lot more. For the boots for this build, we went with recuperation like always. If we pick up an orb of power, we're going to get some health. This is excellent for survivability. And then I went with a stasis weapon surge and a solar weapon surge for the GMs, just so my weapons do a little more damage. Both the Wicked Implement and then the Cartesian Coordinate and the Briar's Contempt doing more damage. Lastly, for the class item, I went with Reaper, so that way every time I pop my rift, the next kill I get will make an orb. And obviously because we're getting so many rifts, we're making a lot of orbs due to that. And when I do pop my rift, any orbs nearby will be picked up immediately due to powerful attraction, which ties in perfectly with the synergy of this build. Lastly, we have Bomber on, which every single time I pop my rift will give me a little boost to grenade energy. And then when I have my grenade, I obviously turn them into turrets, and using the turrets and slowing things gives me more class ability energy. So that's the gameplay loop there, is Bleak Watcher turrets tying into your healing rifts, create a really nice infinite ability loop, freezing and slowing all targets, giving you constant health regen regeneration and constantly giving you an overshield, which is why this build is so unbelievably powerful. Now we're going to break down all the stats that we have on this. First up, we're going with 100 resilience. This is just standard in challenging endgame PvE. I would never go into a Grandmaster this season without 100 resilience, no matter what your build is. Then of course the next most important is going to be our discipline, because we're trying to throw as many grenades as possible, so make sure you get that up to 100. After that, it really doesn't matter much, but if you could, you'd want to get as much recovery as possible. Right now I only ended up with 70, but if I could, I would definitely want those triple 100s with 100 resilience, 100 discipline, and 100 recovery, so that way I'd have as much of a loop as possible. But that's why I'm gonna have to farm duality and get some better artifice armor. So those are all of the stats and mods. Now we're gonna break down the artifact. It's important to note that there are 2 stasis specific artifact mods this season. The first is Pillar of Ice. Defeating an encased combatant spawns stasis crystals. While this is not like a ridiculously OP mod compared to some of the other perks, it's really nice and obviously complements a stasis build, so make sure you have that one selected. Lastly, we also have Hail the Storm, which is shattering encased targets and stasis crystals deals increased damage. Shattering stasis crystals releases shards of ice that damage and slow targets. This will also be really nice and synergize well when we're creating those crystals. Shattering enemies, creating shards, creating an excellent gameplay loop where it looks like you're out there playing like a mayhem match with just crystals and shards flying in every different direction. It feels really cool and really ties into the power fantasy of this build. The only 2 other mods here that tie into this build would be as follows. The first would be From Whence You Came, which is going to do increased ability damage to taken and scored combatants. Now, obviously there's a ton of taken in this, and your Bleak Watcher turret is shooting them like crazy, so make sure you have this on. And then secondly is that those ability kills, when you have your super nearly fully charged, are going to create orbs of power for you. And because you're using this stasis super that's really not that powerful, it's basically just an add clear super, you don't really have to pop your super much, and then you can benefit from creating a ton of orbs for your teammates, so I would recommend those on as well. Other than that though, none of these other mods really complement the build that well, at least when you're using the weapons that I'm using. And that's pretty much everything for this build. That's everything that you need to know in order to utilize this. The dim link to this will be down below, so if you want to click on it, it'll put all of the mods and everything on for you. I encourage you to do that. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to smash the like button and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and click on the screen here to watch another one from this channel. And if you're feeling thirsty out there, make sure to use code LUCKY10p to save some money on G Fuel. Also, make sure you're following me on Twitch and Kick. I go live all the time playing Destiny 2. Lastly, make sure you're following me on X, Instagram, and TikTok, where I deliver Destiny 2 news to you daily. I appreciate all the followers out there.